Oz. Just 2 letters, yet they conjure a realm of magic, wonder, and joy unmatched by any others in the English language. As a world, its potential is boundless, continuously expanded and reimagined by gifted creatives for over a century. It all began with the 1900 novel, a literary cornerstone that spawned a legacy of acclaimed films, books, and musicals. Among these, Wicked stands out. A New York Times best-selling book turned musical phenomenon. So popular, it held its place on Broadway and West End stages, while The Wizard of Oz, its predecessor, has come and gone. L. Frank Baum was born into an America amidst a whirlwind of change, as the newly independent nation carved out its identity on the global stage. In his early years, he witnessed his country torn apart by the Civil War, fighting to end slavery.
Baum was born just before the American Civil War, and he was born in upstate New York and spent most of his early life there. And it wasn't until really the turn of the century that he then wrote the book that we most associated with him, of course, The Wonderful Wizard of Oz.
It was also a time of rapid industrialization, as new railroads and factories were springing up across the country, bringing new commercial innovations that transformed everyday life. An increasingly rich country had increasingly more money to spend on novelty and entertainment. Growing up, Baum would have seen this.
He grew up a lot of the time in Pennsylvania. His family, particularly his father, had become quite rich from the oil industry. He was quite a sickly child. He suffered with angina for most of his life. From the age of 12, he was quite delicate. His upbringing was not what usual boys would go through.
He was quite a dreamy young man. He was known for being dreamy, for loving making stories, writing stories, creative products. And actually, to try and address this, his parents sent him to quite a strict military school.
He had a lasting hatred towards authority figures, particularly in the army, due to that.
While he was there, he was very traumatized. He had what is suspected to be some sort of psychosomatic heart attack when he was being beaten at the school where he received corporal punishment. And he was then brought home, and actually that heart condition or the stress that acted on his heart affected him for the rest of his life.
As a young man, Baum's interests were immediately clear: entrepreneurship and writing. By 17, he was already producing many local publications with his brother, Henry. As Baum entered his 20s, with the help of his father, he began to create small business ventures based on fashionable trends at the time.
Baum sort of replicated his dad in the sense that he wanted to be an inventor and get patents and make his money in that way.
When he was younger, he would have chickens and he would breed chickens, but they would always have to be over the top.
Whilst rearing chickens may not seem like much to us today, at the time it was a fashionable trend, and the Hamburg chickens reared by Baum were the very best of the designer poultry industry. He released a book on the Hamburg chickens, beginning a lifelong trend of working in and writing about fashionable industries.
This idea of Baum being this sort of searcher for new ideas was very reflective of what was happening in America at the time. Actually, he was, as a man, he was a kind of America. When Baum allowed his creativity to sort of take hold, it turns out that is what makes him the money and the notoriety at the end of it all. But I remember that his dad did encourage him by getting him his first typewriter.
By 25, his love for the eccentric, the trendy, and the profitable led him to New York, where he managed a small fleet of theaters his father had built. He began writing and producing plays immediately.
His father owned theatres and gave them to Baum to make these performances.
One of his biggest first plays was The Maid of Arran, which had Scottish roots, but he rewrote it for Ireland, and that toured for some time. When he met Maud Baum, he then, once they had their first child, he then changed from being a jobbing actor, realising that he needed to stay put. So he then became a salesman, selling china.
He ended up marrying a woman who was actually the daughter of a very renowned feminist. And then indeed, this is a theme that we could sort of see running throughout his work of being, comparatively progressive for the time.
Baum and Maud were married in 1892 and shared the same vows at their wedding, something which was unusually equal for the period.
Maud was actually the daughter of a very strong feminist in the late 1800s in America. So her mother, Matilda Jocelyn Gage, was a very radical feminist who is often left out from the history books, but she was up there with some of the strong ones at the time, who was championing the rights for women back in the late 1800s. And Maud had a strong influence on Frank, but also so did the mother-in-law, Matilda.
In 1888, Baum and his family moved out to South Dakota to open a shop, Baum's Bazaar, selling decorative objects, trinkets, and spectacle pieces that brought a bit of magic and joy to the poverty-stricken lives of Americans expanding their country out west.
Leaving upstate New York and heading out west, as so many people did, I think opened his eyes to the fact that we are not all the same.
As a white man growing up, living in late 19th, early 20th century America, this is still a country that is built on settler colonialism and anti-black enslavement. He would have lived through the failure of Reconstruction after the war and the disillusionment. He would have seen the great migration of black people from the South to the North as a way of trying to escape lynching violence. This is also the period of continual westward expansion, which meant the displacement and genocide of indigenous peoples. Unfortunately, we at least know in his own words that he had very strong feelings about this. When you go back and read them, especially the second one, it has to do with after the death of the great leader Sitting Bull. He just sort of seems to think that people should that the U.S. settler nation state should just finish the job and just, this was a tragedy, but now these savage people have to be eliminated. And so perhaps in that way, I think there's something a bit sinister about the idea of imagining this whole new land that one gets to discover, and maybe positioning his female protagonist and her empowerment in terms of colonial exploration.
The pioneer has before declared that our only safety depends upon the total extermination of the Indians. Having wronged them for centuries, we had better, in order to protect our civilization, follow it up by one more wrong, and wipe these untamed and untamable creatures from the face of the earth.
I think what happened to Baum is that he used perhaps the discomfort of being in an unfamiliar place to feed a story about a little girl who was in grave discomfort in a place that nobody had ever told her about.
2 years after opening, Baum's Bazaar ran out of money and had to close. The shop had been poorly managed, with Baum giving out a lot of stock on credit to regular clients and spending his days outside the shop telling stories to the children on the town.
He'd been a playwright, he'd been a salesman, he'd run theatres and opera houses for his family, and Matilda heard him speaking to children locally who would come and he would tell these little stories to the children. And Matilda insisted, and she was quite a prolific writer herself, doing the Champion, that you should write down these stories and write them for children.
Taking Matilda's advice in 1897, Baum released Mother Goose in prose, illustrated by Maxfield Parrish. The book was a modest success, but financially lucrative enough to allow Baum to quit his job as a traveling salesman. It is around this time that Baum began working with another illustrator. His most famous collaborator, W. Denslow. The two initially met working on a magazine of Baum's, but quickly began collaborating on a follow-up story to Mother Goose, entitled Father Goose.
It was lavishly illustrated and printed in colour. It's something as a passion project with them, and they didn't want to just produce a book for children. And this was more rhymes than it was a fairy tale book.
That became an enormous success, and was the best-selling children's book in America when it was published. And I think this is something many people aren't aware of, because they only know about The Wizard of Oz, first called The Wonderful Wizard of Oz, when it was first published in 1900. And they don't realize that there was already a kind of frame in which L. Frank Baum was already a very well-known name.
Fresh off the back of their success with Father Goose, Denslow and Frank started work on their next story. It was based on stories Frank had been telling local children about a girl called Dorothy and their adventures in a strange land called Oz. Denslow set to work bringing the characters to life.
They were very much a partnership in the early days, so Father Goose was a partnership between the two of them. And The Wonderful Wizard of Oz, they both owned the copyright to that. It wasn't Frank's copyright or Denslow's copyright. They owned the copyright together.
Illustrations should always add to the text rather than copy the text. Illustrations are a story of their own. And it's a very tricky balance, but when it's done well, as it's been done well here, it lasts a lifetime.
They wanted to produce a lavish 24-page colour plate book and colour on almost every single page, which was completely unheard of in the late 1800s. To the point that they believed in this project that most publishing houses would not touch it. They had to fund a lot of this themselves to get this book produced.
Denslow was a graphic artist of the turn of the century whose great strength was in strong outlines, small stubby characters, and energy and motion. But he also used patterning. There are lots of stories, lots of illustrations of Denslow in which the same character is repeated 3 or 4 times in a row, with maybe the 5th iteration being a little bit different, like 4 soldiers standing straight, but the 5th one looking off to see what's coming on the next page. Those illustrations are comic and they are persuasive. They live as close to the original novel as, say, Ernest Shepard's drawings of Pooh and Piglet live with A.A. Milne's work.
In 1900, L. Frank Baum and W. Denslow introduced the world to the Wonderful Wizard of Oz.
When L. Frank Baum wrote The Wonderful Wizard of Oz, a true American fantasy had not yet been written. He did it not for filthy lucre, though he earned quite a bit from it. He did it to amuse his children, and I'm convinced he did it because Alice in Wonderland had been one of the best-selling books in the United States for children, and probably that means for everybody, for 40 years. For 40 years. So, people of L. Frank Baum's generation grew up reading Alice in Wonderland and having this archetype of leaving the boring Victorian world and entering into some place where everything meant something different. I do believe that Dorothy, Gale, and Alice from Alice in Wonderland are first cousins, separated by an ocean.
What I kind of like about this, and compared with Alice in Wonderland, I think this is less moral. It's not telling you off or telling you there's a way to be. I don't know, it feels more loose than Alice in Wonderland, which is more crazy, but seems to have more of a... I just think in my mind, is Alice in Wonderland a book which is sort of teaching people how to be? Don't be this, do be that.
In the initial introduction, one of the things that L. Frank Baum himself writes is about the difference between old-time fairy tales, and he says, I want to modernize the fairy tale. And he also argues that there is a difference between what is learned in schools and what is learned through fairy tales. So he says, modern education includes morality. Therefore, the modern child seeks only entertainment. The idea of the division between morality and amusement is a foundational narrative in children's literature.
I do believe that there are a lot of theorists who can find arguments, political arguments about the financial underpinnings of the American economy in Baum's work. Say, for instance, the scarecrow representing the American Agrarian movement and the Tin Man representing industry and industrialization. I don't think those are false leads, but I do think what L. Frank Baum did was take the tropes of his times. He was at one point, after all, a newspaper editor and wrote editorials about these matters, and he transformed them. I don't think he was trying to write a parable for adults through a children's book for his 4 boys. I think he just, like any child inventing in the backyard, took what there was and ran with it and made something new out of it.
The heroes are ordinary people throughout the Oz series, like ordinary, usually farm working boys and girls who then go on these magical journeys. Like there's something about the enchantment of everyday life and the way that the ordinary things like chickens, things like statues and ornaments can come to life and being animated with wonder that I think is incredibly important.
After the death of Matilda Joslyn Gage in 1888, Frank continued to promote her ideas about gender equality, making the protagonist of his novel female.
When we think of the 19th century as a period that was full of like classic adventure tales, thinking about Treasure Island and so many other things, how many girls get to be the protagonist? That in and of itself becomes a fascinating thing, and the fact that there's so many strong female characters, although sometimes I don't like that phrase because it's a bit reductive, but the Wicked Witch of the West, we have Glinda, there's so many different characters in the world of Oz who are powerful, who are authoritative, and who are often like far more morally contemplated than simply being the good guys or the bad guys.
It's really interesting. By the way, it's interesting to see what is male and female in here. You know, what is female is the intuitive magic and sorcery, and the Wizard of Oz is just a man.
Well, I guess it's very easy to read that the wizard is a stand-in for Baum himself, of course. Again, the sort of traveling salesman, the sort of ingenuity, especially like the Yankee style of ingenuity, I think we could also see that as a particular trope of the time. Here I'm thinking about a text people might be familiar with, Mark Twain's A Connecticut Yankee in King Arthur's Court, that again, a modern day, well in that case 19th century, Yankee goes back to medieval times and he uses all the technology to seem like he's a wizard. And so with The Wizard of Oz, we have a version of that someone from the modern day ends up in this magical land and everyone thinks that he has magical powers because he knows how to manipulate and use all the tactics that he has developed as a salesman to then sort of fool people who are actually magical into thinking he's magical.
The idea that an American fantasy land could in any way stand in the same room with Narnia and Camelot and Middle-earth and Neverland. It was a kind of, not to mention Wonderland as well, of course, the mother of them all. It would have been a kind of blasphemy.
My name is Lem Sissay and I am a writer. We are in the Foundling Museum, which is in the heart of Bloomsbury, which is in central London. This is the first place where children were brought to be adopted or fostered while their parents got their lives together. If I was to take away family from you right now, you would slowly start to realize how much of your behavior depends on the family that you've had. Dorothy Gale, the character at the heart of The Wonderful Wizard of Oz, is a foster child. She was fostered by her Uncle Henry and her Auntie Em. That is why this story fascinates me. I've lived that life. So I've lived the life where the imagination is as real as this physical space. The power of storytelling is the power that makes a person who feels isolated in society feel that my imagination, how I want to be, and how I want my world to be, is possible. But I need to imagine it first. The Tin Man, the Scarecrow and the Lion are her imaginary friends, all with character traits that she needs to survive in her adult life. And in not having a family to be able to exercise your courage, you can see your courage or see your heart or see your intelligence. Not being seen means that those muscles are not being exercised. Oz, left to himself, smiled to think of his success in giving the Scarecrow and the Tin Woodman and the Lion exactly what they thought they wanted. "How can I help being a humbug," he said, "when all these people make me do things that everybody knows can't be done? It was easy to make the Scarecrow and the Lion and the Woodman happy because they imagined I could do anything." That's it, that's the whole book. Superman Was a Foundling, which is the name of my piece of work here at the Foundling Museum, is a list of names of characters from fiction who are adopted, fostered or orphaned. You have Dorothy Gale and then you have Harry Potter, for example, and they are heroes in our eyes, but also they could be seen as quite self-centered, for example. We choose to see them as heroes, when in fact, what I think that they are doing is what is natural for a child who has not got any parents does. They are searching for who they are and for their place in the world. I don't think of that as a hero's journey. I think of that as the journey of any person who would find themselves in that situation.
In the years leading up to the release of The Wonderful Wizard of Oz, L. Frank Baum was sharpening his marketing prowess. He created magazines offering shopkeepers tips on eye-catching window displays and crafted compelling narrative advertisements for his father's cast-iron company. This flair for unusual marketing techniques is something Baum brought to selling his book, The Wonderful Wizard of Oz.
In the first 2 years after the publication of The Wonderful Wizard of Oz, it was the best-selling American children's book right away. But I think the fact that he was already a very successful published children's author, and that his name was already well known, and that he went directly into publicizing the book himself through theatre, through musical, almost directly after the publication of the book, I think this all fed in to how The Wizard of Oz became what is kind of known as the American fairy tale.
In 1902, Broadway was enchanted by the debut of The Wizard of Oz musical, a light-hearted and comedic adaptation of L. Frank Baum's novel. This production introduced unique characters like Imogen the cow and featured pioneering special effects that vividly brought the land of Oz to life.
Dorothy doesn't become Dorothy Gale until the 1902 musical, and then after that point she's then referred to as Dorothy Gale in the books. And again, Dorothy Gale was a pun as part of the musical, gale, whirlwind, tornado, that kind of thing. There is no Toto. The pet is a pantomime cow essentially called Imogen. So this again was written for the comedy of the time of what people would expect. L. Frank Baum himself didn't like the initial changes that were made to the story and the ghostwriting, but once it became successful, he understood why those changes were made. The characters of the Scarecrow and the Tin Woodman were very famous actors at the time, known as Montgomery and Stone, who they are the ones that the fame caught off with their two characterizations of the Tin Woodman and the Scarecrow, and they became very famous off the back of this production that made it to Broadway and kept running successfully for nearly 10 years.
The musical was a major success, and toured throughout America for many years, earning both Baum and Denslow huge amounts of money.
L. Frank Baum made a fortune from more money from the Wizard of Oz musical than they actually did from the book itself. Denslow even used his riches to go and purchase his own private island in the Bermuda and pretty much remained there until he died. It's because of that musical, really, that we get a series that lasts, which then gives us The Wizard of Oz, which then gives us Wicked. I don't think we would have had that legacy had the series not continued and the musical had been so popular at the time.
But as the musical adaptation gained momentum, tensions between them began to surface. Behind the curtains, a dramatic falling out over rights and creative control unfolded, threatening the future of Oz. Disagreements over financial shares and artistic decisions led to a bitter rift, marking the end of their fruitful partnership. In the early 20th century, L. Frank Baum created the Fairylogues, an innovative multimedia show combining live storytelling, hand-color slides, and early cinema to bring his enchanting tales to life.
He has a touring company that gives elements of the books mixed in with live actors playing the Oz characters from the books, because this is how popular it is by 1909, and also uses footage from film as well, which plays out some of the sequences, and he mixes in the live action with himself as the narrator, a child playing Dorothy, and the different characters mixed in with footage, and it was very elaborate and it lost money. Frank is the extrovert, the showman who wants to put on lavish and elaborate displays, and Maud is the one with the money, but Maud is running the house, she's not running the Fairylogues. So he's more concentrating on pouring his money into making this look as lavish as possible. And there are two factors to maybe think about, which is, again, theatre, and then the upcoming movie industry that's just starting at this point in time. It's not about children, and what Frank is presenting is a children's story. It's a children's show travelling, and people are not quite ready yet for children's entertainment. Adults wouldn't drag their kids there because they want to go for adult entertainment, and that and the overspending on this is a big factor. And whilst it might have been a successful spectacle, it wasn't successfully priced or sold to be able to pay for all of these actors, all this footage and all this elaborate stuff that Frank wants to show to people.
The ambitious Fairylogues drained much of L. Frank Baum's earnings from the success of the Wizard of Oz musical. Yet, this financial setback opened the door to a revolutionary new medium, film.
A studio called Selig produces some short films of about 10 minutes based upon his books.
In 1914, eager to explore the new and exciting world of cinema, Baum founded the Oz Films Manufacturing Company. Despite the innovative storytelling and special effects in films like The Patchwork Girl of Oz, commercial success eluded them, and financial disaster wasn't far behind.
Frank was bankrupt a few times in his life, and towards the end of his life he bankrupts himself by his involvement with things such as different Oz films and media. And eventually, he's quite crafty though towards the end, so he passes on most of his assets to his wife, so that when he files for bankruptcy, it's on him, and he's only filing such things such as a typewriter which he needs for his job. So he doesn't lose as much in his final bankruptcy, so he does at least learn one thing. But he's forever going bankrupt because he's always overspending until Maud eventually takes in the purse for any expenditure. And she also takes on the rights to the Oz books towards the end as well, so he transfers those to her, so she has control of Oz and the royalties that he gets from those in the future. It's a shame really she didn't do it earlier, so that he had a bit more control, and he probably would have made a lot more money for them.
On May 6, 1919, the visionary behind the World of Oz passed away, leaving behind a legacy that would outlive him by generations. By the time of his death, L. Frank Baum had penned 14 full-length Oz novels. But the story didn't end there. Baum's publishers, Riley and Lee, who had rebranded in 1919, were determined not to let the beloved series die with its creator. They continued the legacy, ensuring that the magic of Oz lived on for future generations.
People are trying to get the copyrights to the Oz books to produce films. Maud owns most of the copyrights after L. Frank Baum's death in 1919, so she owns the purse strings to that. There are several attempts to bring this to film, just nobody really, certainly back then, figures out how to do this and to make it popular. You have a 1925 black and white film that is made, which features Oliver Hardy as the Tin Man in it. It's a dreadful movie. It doesn't really lean on the original source material. It tries to adult it, probably because they're thinking, well, the 1902 musical, and it probably lends a little bit more from that than it does from the original story, because adult audiences want this kind of material, not kids. There is a 1933 short-form animated movie that is made by Ted Esper, and this is the first time ever that we have the scene starting in Kansas with Dorothy, and it starts in black and white, and when she arrives in Oz it goes to Technicolor. Technicolor is a brand new chemical colorization for film. Early 30s, we're now experimenting with colour. There's two reasons why this film never becomes popular. One is Walt Disney has just bought the rights to Technicolor on film. So this film gets barred from being released in Technicolor because Walt Disney has an exclusivity for Technicolor, because Technicolor is better than two-strip animation at the time where they're using two strips of colour. Other issue is they don't have the rights to release The Wizard of Oz, and there's a whole of a drama, legal drama behind that. It kind of gets a soft black and white release, and it never really gets out there for those two reasons. Walt Disney tries really hard to get the rights to The Wonderful Wizard of Oz, with it in mind to be one of his next sequels after Snow White. Reportedly, Moore doesn't like Walt Disney and sells it elsewhere, and it ends up in MGM's hands, and MGM creates The Wizard of Oz as competition to Snow White.
MGM is Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer, and they were the combination of these three studios, Metro, Goldwyn, and Mayer. These three moguls got together and made this big studio. And they had their own slate of contract players and crew members, and they made films in that kind of old-style Hollywood studio system.
The main big player would be Mr. Mayer. He bought the rights from Sam Goldwyn.
Perhaps MGM was trying to answer Disney, which had just put out Snow White a couple of years earlier, and it had taken the world by storm as well. Another big full feature, well, the first feature animated film in full Technicolor.
One of the things that's quite different with The Wizard of Oz, but I think it all adds to its appeal really, it brings something quite different to it, is that there was many directors. There were quite a few in different parts. So initially they had hired Norman Taurog, and he was the one who first started filming, and you might have seen some of those early shots of Judy in screen tests and stuff where she's got long blonde ringlets and stuff like that. That was his vision, and it wasn't working. It was played too cutesy, it was played like a fairy tale, and it wasn't working. So they then got George Cukor in, and he was the one who stripped it of that prettiness, who wanted Judy to look more like a Kansas farm girl. Just got her in pigtails, wiped loads of the makeup off, a bit like James Mason does in A Star Is Born. Shroop, shroop, shroop. Let's get you looking like you. And then they got Victor Fleming to do the action of it. Victor Fleming apparently was more like Gable than Gable. So Victor Fleming was this dashing guy, masculine, and he was good at directing action. So the main part where she's in Oz and they have a quest and they're going to try and find the wizard and they're doing this and that was all shot by Victor Fleming because he was good at action. However, when it came, which they filmed near the end, even though it's the beginning of the film, when they filmed the Kansas part of things in black and white and you need more sentimentality, they got a director called King Vidor to do that. King Vidor had worked in silent films, and he said he was particularly pleased with the staging that he brought to the filming of Over the Rainbow, this song. He said that usually, at that time in Technicolor movies or, movies being made at the time, if there was a song, they would film it like someone was sort of on stage. They would plant them, they would sing the song out to the camera. Whereas he directed silent films and he wanted Judy to move around. He wanted Dorothy to wander around the farmyard and get, like they used to do in the silent movies, get more movement, not have it as a production number, but just as someone singing as they wandered around to get that more realistic feeling. There were so many directors used because different directors were good at different things, or the team at MGM felt that certain areas weren't working.
The producers and the moguls, the people who ran the studios, were everything. They controlled everything. So it was quite a different situation than it is now. The director wasn't quite as important. The director was a hired person to kind of corral everything together and make it work. The producers and the studio moguls were the ones who were calling all the shots.
David O. Selznick was working on Gone with the Wind, so they were swapping people at the same time of, can I have you for a bit for The Wizard of Oz and you can go and do that on Gone with the Wind for a bit. And there was things like that going on. People had time restrictions as well. They're meant to do other gigs. And The Wizard of Oz, the filming of that took a lot longer than they thought it was going to do, and a lot longer than films of that time took to make because of so many firsts, I think it took about 6 months in the end to film The Wizard of Oz, which in the 30s was unheard of. And, people had other commitments to go to. So I think they got different people in because they provided different services, they brought different things to it, but also because they had to.
This is a much more ambitious film than they were normally making. They were rattling them off 2 or 3 films a month back in these days because they were making them very simply and very leanly, where this is a huge giant production. It took them 6 months to shoot this film. So it cost them $3 million, which is more than anything had ever cost at that time. This film set this film apart from all the other adaptations that went before, is that they had this technology that they could actually do justice to the story and bring all that kind of imaginative stuff to life on screen for the first time in Technicolor. I can't imagine what it would have felt like to walk in and watch this movie in 1939 when it first came out and have that hit you. Because even now you watch it and it hits you. You still are knocked back in your seat by it all these years later.
I don't think we can underestimate the impact of The Wizard of Oz on wider musical theatre practice and arguably theatre practice. What's some of those key things we remember about the film? The use of Technicolor. The use of Technicolor from those greys into this phantasmagorical land of colour. Not only the yellow brick road in all its glory, but the change to ruby slippers from silver slippers, and of course Emerald City, the greens in all their glory.
This was a very different film on a lot of levels. Probably for a lot of people it was the first film they ever saw that had synchronized sound and colour as well.
Witches weren't really known as green until this film. The peaked hat was something that comes from the Baum era, but again, witches in a peaked hat and green are from this movie, so they take this and build the mythology even more from that particular film.
For audiences, it was a film that showed them something they had never seen before. They were used to seeing everything in kind of dull, drab black and white, and all of a sudden this film, which of course is one of the most colorful films still ever made, it just assaulted them. It assaulted all their senses.
My understanding of life on the set of the film is it's quite tough for Judy. So while she has fun doing it, she's struggling with a very controlling parent who is her mother, who is almost living vicariously through Judy's fame, who used to act herself. A lot of times she would be on a very, very strict diet to keep her thin, so by all accounts she was ordered to have chicken soup daily no matter what she wanted to keep her weight down.
They didn't have unions to protect them, or at least they weren't as powerful as they are now, and they would have just had to be on set for hours and hours and hours, and they shot things over and over again without breaks and wearing these big heavy costumes, so people looking out for their well-being were probably rare. So there were probably a lot of people who were, especially the children, were working very long days and long hours, and that's been documented. The pressures on Judy Garland to lose weight, to fit into costumes, and to just look younger, and all of those pressures, which wouldn't happen now, but made life very hard for people on a film like this, which is very demanding. It had to look a certain way.
Margaret Hamilton particularly looked out for Judy Garland. Apparently she really stood up for her with the head of the studio at the time when he was behaving inappropriately, to make sure that Judy did things like celebrate her birthday properly and things like that.
The whole film is about yearning. I mean, and I think that's what the musical captures, especially with this Over the Rainbow song, which is the key moment in the film, which is Dorothy's yearning. And it's what I think that's what makes the film such a classic.
The film with Judy Garland, that gingham dress, the blue and the white, is so iconic.
Why Judy Garland works as the role of Dorothy Gale, as opposed to other similar child stars of the time, and when I say similar, I mean of a similar ilk, is because she's got that acting ability. She's not cutesy. Not to say that she's not cute, because she was. But, she hasn't got that cutesy little girly way about her. She plays it with real authenticity. And I think the scene in the film that really stands out to me, that really brings her acting chops to the fore, is when, at the beginning, when you're in Kansas and Miss Gulch threatens to take Toto away and have him destroyed. It's her response to that. It makes me cry every time, because I believe that this is a girl having her dog taken away, and she's crying to her aunt and uncle, who don't do enough, by the way.
Well, she was only 16 at the time, so she was very young, and she was one of these people that they had pegged to become a star. So this was her first big starring role, and everybody thought she was a little too old to play the character, which is quite hilarious. But in the book, the character is much younger, so it was a bit of a change from the way the story was written. But she obviously she proved her mettle. She more than proved it, and went on to have this incredible career.
Judy Garland is one of the most famous singers, actors, performers of all time, and really, she was very, very young when she was cast in and performed in The Wizard of Oz. Famously, that now icon, that anthem, if you like, Somewhere Over the Rainbow, was not due to make the final cut of the film. Of course it did, and history, as they say, was written at that point.
Shirley Temple was in the running originally for the role, but she couldn't sing as well. I think Roger Edens, who worked at MGM, who was Judy's sort of he wrote special arrangements for her. He was her sort of guide in a way. I think he kept her informed of what was going on. And also the studios didn't want to borrow someone from another studio and make a big star of them, or, a bigger star of them or whatever, when they had their own Dorothy right there, But I think she was aware of the competition, but hey, they couldn't sing like her, could they?
So Judy Garland come in after we didn't get anywhere with Shirley Temple. She'd already been working for MGM. Judy Garland very much has the look more pretty than the original Denslow version of Dorothy. She's got the brown braided hair. She's a little bit plump. That's not a horror thing to say, because she always struggled with her weight, and Dorothy is described as a little bit plump. So they decided to go with Judy because they need this voice, and I think the voice that carries the movie is Judy's voice, her Over the Rainbow. Shirley Temple has a very, very different voice to Judy Garland, and once it becomes Judy, the film really starts to come together. But even initially, she looks older in the first iterations of it. They mess around with Judy's look all the time because they really want her, but they want to change her look. They play around with prosthetics on the nose and all sorts to get the look right and eventually go to a look that is her natural beauty. But it's really, she's done other roles, but this is her first big iconic role, and her lasting legacy, essentially.
That voice with that song is, I mean, if you even just start speaking about it, you can hear it. It is haunting in many ways. It's pure and clean, and that's part of, obviously, her age at that time.
The Wizard of Oz definitely boosted her career massively. You know, it was her first lead starring role where the film was built around her character and she was the full-on proper lead. Before then, she'd done stuff with Mickey Rooney or as a smaller, I can sing part, but this was properly her first starring vehicle, and definitely the huge success of it made her star ascend even higher.
The score of the MGM musical, the Harold Arlen score, and also the Yip Harburg lyrics and the way he played with wordplay were deeply inspiring to me.
It's very hard to imagine the way they released films back then, because you couldn't just watch it whenever you wanted to, and they had very limited windows when they were in the cinemas because other films were coming to fill the cinemas immediately afterwards. So it was a very different kind of experience to go see a film. You can imagine that when they were making this film, they had no idea. They had no idea that they were creating something that would still be iconic almost a century later. They changed cinema, they changed the way we think about things. And, Dorothy's costume is so iconic that you can't see anything even similar to that without thinking of her. And everything about the film is like that. It's all ingrained in your memory. The colors, the clothing, the creatures, the Wicked Witch is just, every Wicked Witch since then looks just like her, because why would you make one that looked any different? Because she was the perfect Wicked Witch.
I first heard as a kid the score for Wizard of Oz, had the record, played it over and over again. So when I was going into professionally wanting to be a theater composer, a musical theater composer, that was one of the influences on me.
As a critic, I loved it. I still love it. It's one of my favorite films, just simply because it's so well put together and the story is so strong, and mainly because it pulls you in and it makes you identify with these characters, and it makes you live this experience.
Financially, it wasn't deemed as a massive success, but that was in terms of cash because they'd spent so much on making it. They didn't make all the money back straight away or at the time, and so that in terms it's sort of seen as not a success, but it was a huge success. Loads of people went to see it, but again, most of the people going to see it were children and they were charged half.
The true financial triumph emerged decades later. In the 1950s, television became a household staple, with TV ownership soaring from 3 million to 55 million homes by the decade's end. CBS acquired the TV rights and began annual broadcasts in 1956. The magic of Oz couldn't be contained.
In my household growing up, my parents were skeptical about television, and they endorsed reading. So our library cards were the biggest gift they could give to us, and they were the gifts that were the most influential in all of our lives, all 7 of us kids. Most of my brothers and sisters are writers, in fact. However, skeptical as they were about American TV, they did relinquish their strong hold over the power cord for the TV, and once a year allow us to watch The Wizard of Oz.
People were watching it in black and white on TV, which is really hard to imagine, and that's how most people discovered this film. So when they finally did see it, when on a re-release or when they watched it again when color television came around, it would have been a whole nother experience for them. I think I watched it in black and white the first time on television when I was a little kid, and I that was how I saw it. That was how everybody watched it.
We'd come in and sit down on the sofa and watch that film with a kind of religious fervor, because it only was on once a year. It was before the days of the video mesmerama, when everything could be seen whenever you wanted it, or you could pause a film and go back and rewatch a scene, or skip the boring parts, like when Dorothy sings, just skip over them and get on to something else. It became a kind of rite of passage every year. It became part of our liturgical calendar. There was Christmas, there was Easter, there was The Wizard of Oz. And the same event was happening in the lives of all the children of the neighborhood, too. So it was a kind of cultural glue for children to experience The Wizard of Oz on the same night, in the same way they experience Halloween on the same night, or Christmas Eve.
Well, what you have to understand about, in America, at least for my generation, everybody knew The Wizard of Oz by heart, because it was on television every year. In fact, the first time I ever saw color TV was when I went to a friend's house, because my family did not have a color TV, when I went to see The Wizard of Oz broadcast on television in color. And so when Dorothy came out of the house in Munchkinland and suddenly it went all to color, that was the first time I'd ever seen color on television, so it made a very deep impression.
The broadcast turned the tide, significantly boosting its popularity and financial returns.
The day that I decided I was ready to begin writing Wicked, I was in the Lake District. I went to Beatrix Potter's farm, and I was walking around, having just turned 39 years old. I had just become 1 year older than my mother was, who died in childbirth when I was born. She died at 38. I became 39. I thought, I must be old enough to write a grown-up book now, because I'm older than my mother ever was, and she was the grown-up who brought me in. So I was walking along, and I thought, all right, what do we know? What do we know about The Wizard of Oz from our common memories? And I thought, well, we have the house falling on the witch. What do we know about the dead original witch? All we know about her, she has feet. We know nothing else. She could have been grossly fat. She could have been morbidly obese. She could have been as large as a house, and then the house fell on her. And all we saw were her feet. I began to see, we have no backstory in L. Frank Baum. Everything is up for the grabs. So I began to think about Glinda and the Wicked Witch of the West. My memory of the film is that there's one scene in 1939 film where Billy Burke comes down and is all pink and fluffy, and Margaret Hamilton is all clawed and crabbed, and Margaret Hamilton says something like, "I might have known you'd be behind this, Glinda." This was my memory. And I thought, now why is she using Glinda's first name? They've known each other. Maybe they've known each other for a long time. Maybe they went to college together. And I fell down onto the ground in the Lake District laughing at the thought that they went to college together. And that was where Glinda began to be Glinda and Elphaba began to be Elphaba, with the concept that they had known each other before. Now, I challenge you to go back to any video cassette of The Wonderful Wizard of Oz and see if there really is a line that says, "I might have known you'd be behind this, Glinda." I think I was making that up, but that was my subconscious talking to me. I don't think that line actually appears in the movie.
London, 1993. Gregory Maguire, a children's author, was putting the finishing touches on his first draft of Wicked, The Life and Times of the Wicked Witch of the West.
I grew up in a large family, 7 children, headed by my father, who was a writer. He was a newspaper journalist. So, as all kids emulate their parents, whether playing cooking games or, construction games or whatever it is that they see their parents doing, the 7 of us kids all played newspaper when we came around to our imaginative games. I therefore began to write, really somewhat seriously, I suppose, by the time I was about 9, making stories up that I liked so much that I saved them, and I still have them. I still have a huge box of about 200 stories written between American 4th grade and the end of American high school. The first book that I ever wrote was called The Lightning Time. I wrote it when I was in college. I slipped through the professional threshold of being a writer almost by accident, because when I had finished writing my first novel, which was for children, it was like a Harry Potter novel, sort of, only pre-Harry Potter, I read it and I thought, well, this might not be very good, but I've read things in the library that are worse, so maybe this is a real book and maybe I'm a real writer already. I spent a year typing it up, sending it out to publishers, and the 4th publisher to whom I submitted it said, sure, we'll take a risk on you, why not? It seems to me that in writing a novel, if you're paying close attention to the subtleties of the idea in your brain, you have to discover how to write all over again with each project. Every novel has a different kind of incandescence to it, and the reason that it attracts you as an idea is that you don't really understand it. So you have to go spelunking, or you have to go intergalactic traveling and discover how the machines work with each effort. When I was a kid, of course, I just wrote, there was a man and his name was Joe, and I wrote to the end of the first book. When I wrote a book like Wicked, I did it the same way. I wrote the first sentence, and I wrote in a single stream over a 5-month period until I got to the last sentence. I wrote Wicked when I was living in London, and in our kitchen in West Hampstead, not too far from where Doris Lessing lived, as a matter of fact, there were 5 kitchen cabinets. When I would have an idea, a visual idea or an exchange of conversation, I would write it on an index card and Scotch tape it to one of the 5 cabinets. At that time of my life, all my books had 5 parts because I only had 5 cabinet doors, and that was easy to organize the story on the arrangement of 5 discrete blocks. While I was living there, the first Gulf War started. Desert Storm, I think we called it back then, when we were naming wars like DVD collections. Desert Storm, Volume 1. In London, there was a great deal of enthusiasm and support for the people of Kuwait, especially for the Kuwaitis who were living in London. And I noticed a lot of the newspaper headlines calling Saddam Hussein the next Hitler in a very frightening way. And I caught in myself how frightening the word Hitler was when used in a headline. At the same time, there was a terrible tragedy, which most people know about the abduction and the murder of little Jamie Bulger, if that's how you say his name. I've never been sure. A 2-year-old boy who wandered away from his mother's apron strings and was dead by nightfall. When a manhunt for his murderers became a boy hunt, and it was discovered that 2 schoolboys had started the day deciding to skip school and ending the day as murderers, that prompted in England a lot of talk about where the impulse to do such an evil thing might have arisen. Both those stories were about aggression. One was perhaps a necessary aggression, one was certainly not a necessary aggression, but together the narratives chased each other in my brain as I tried to think about what is evil and what are my obligations as an American living abroad to think about the invasion of Kuwait. I couldn't deal with the pressure about not being able to answer what the nature of evil is, so I did what most writers have done in the history of time and why we have writing at all. I decided I'll write a book about it and I will discover everything there is to be known about being wicked. There were 2 things that are interesting about how I constructed Wicked. One is that on my kitchen cabinet doors, I made a timeline of all the events in the novel, and underneath that, I made a timeline of all the events in the film. And some of them lined up exactly like Dorothy's house crash landing in Oz. That happens in the movie, happens in the book. But a lot of the scenes from the movie are slightly off chronology from what happens in the book, if not many of them. And I decided that I would pitch my scenes in the interstices, in the lattice slats, between the events that occurred in the book or the movie. If I were to write about something as it actually happens in the movie, 1939 movie or the 1900 book, then I made sure it happened from somebody else's point of view, not from the point of view of the character in either of those scenes. So that gave me structure and it gave me liberty. And boy, did I use the liberty. I wanted really to see if someone could become evil, or if in fact, as Glinda says in the play, have evil thrust upon them. I didn't know the answer to that. I'm not sure that I still do. But I began to be interested in the question when I was about 30, and I began to realize that the Wicked Witch of the West would be a good armature upon which to hang that question, because after all, she has wicked as part of her name. It's a capital W, the Wicked Witch of the West. The concept for Wicked originally was that I would write a story from birth to death about a person who was a sociopath or a psychopath. It was as if I were to sit down and write Humbert, the life and times of a sociopath. I really intended not to correct her and not to change her behavior, just to follow her actions and see how she became so bad. That was my original aesthetic ambition. That was my drive. That was my destination. Then I wrote a scene early in the novel where Elphaba, at the age of about 2, is crawling on the floorboards of her humble home, and she pees on the floor. And she puts down her green nose to smell her own piss, and she smiles at it. I intended this to be evidence of her animal nature, her corrupt nature, her degraded humanity. The next morning, when I got up and read the passage before to prime the pump for what was going to come next, I read that paragraph, and my heart broke. I thought, oh my goodness, you poor thing. Nobody is ever going to understand you, are they? At that moment, I realized I had to put my preconceptions about what I was doing aside, and I had a kind of moral duty to let this person become herself, not merely to use her for my ambitions about evil. So I followed where she went, and I took notes like any reporter. I do believe that the Oz that I was writing is exactly to the molecule as dystopian as the world in which we live. I did not want to make it any more grim than the world that we find ourselves having inherited and that we will bequeath to our heirs and assigns. But I wanted it to be just as beautiful and challenging and inspiriting and maddening and corrupt as our own world. It is hard to see somebody change before your eyes. And if they do, you have to ask yourself the question, were they always like that? Were they always malicious? Were they always belligerent? Were they always destructive and dangerous? Or was I too innocent to see it? As soon as Wicked the novel was published, it began to get Hollywood interest. And by that I mean within the first 2 or 3 weeks, my agent was beginning to field offers from Hollywood for a major motion picture. We took our time to decide on which offer to consider and which offer to accept. The movie development went through some bumps, and after 3 or 4 years, a successful, acceptable script had not yet been reached. Part of it was because Wicked anticipated the revival of literary fantasy for the young and for those who read books for the young, such as J.K. Rowling and Philip Pullman. We were all just about the same time, but I think Wicked got in the door first. There had not been big, expensive fantasy movies yet. Peter Jackson had not landed his first Lord of the Rings film, which made so much money, it was so successful. So the Hollywood studios were a bit anxious about putting a literal $100 million behind a movie that was largely featuring women and didn't have a role for Mel Gibson, who was the hot star at the time. The scripts were, to my eye, unsuccessful, and they strayed far from my plot. But I had children to feed and a mortgage that I would have liked to pay off, so I was going to just swallow and smile and take the money if they were ever going to offer it. While all this was going on, Stephen Schwartz, the composer, happened to be vacationing.
A friend of mine was in Hawaii playing for a singer and invited me to come to Hawaii for the weekend. And I had a free weekend and sort of randomly jumped on a plane. And the singer is a folk singer named Holly Near. My friend is a wonderful accompanist named John Bacchino, also a wonderful composer. But and then the day after the concert, we went on a little snorkeling trip just to relax. And just making idle conversation on the boat on the way back from snorkeling, Holly said, "Oh, I'm reading this really interesting book. It's called Wicked, and it's kind of the Oz story from the Wicked Witch's point of view." And sort of every hair on my arms stood up.
He went back to the mainland, got the book, read it, found out immediately in Hollywood that the rights were sewn up, and went to the offices of Universal Studios.
A lot of people had to be convinced that it should be a musical instead of the non-musical movie that was in the process of being developed. First of all, Mark Platt, who was running Universal Pictures at the time, had to be persuaded that maybe instead of continuing to develop the screenplay, they might consider it as a musical, and in fact a stage musical at first.
Mark was completely convinced because he and everybody in Hollywood had been seeing, among other things, how much money Disney was raking in with The Lion King and Beauty and the Beast on Broadway. So Mark said, "You're going to have to go and meet Gregory Maguire and see if you can persuade him, because he's the one who owns the rights and will make the decisions."
In order for Gregory to say yes, it meant he had to give up a good deal of money up front, because obviously he was being paid as the movie was being developed. And I had a few arguments.
And Stephen Schwartz said, "I know you have children to raise, and I know you want the big bucks that selling a book to Hollywood will bring you."
I said that I felt that everyone had an idea of what Oz looked like based on the 1939 movie. And as I say, particularly at that time, it was very famous in America. So if you did a movie and it didn't look like that, and in fact, you didn't see someone who looked like Billy Burke as Glinda or Margaret Hamilton as the witch, people were going to be put off.
Stephen Schwartz said, "I'm so convinced you're going to see the rightness of this idea that I'll admit to you, I've already conceived of the first song. It's going to be called No One Mourns the Wicked. No one mourns the wicked." Those 5 words sold the idea to me, because those 5 words of Stephen Schwartz's persuaded me he knew why I had written the book. The person who wrote the movie script had no clue. Stephen Schwartz knew, and he had my blessing from that moment, though he didn't know about it for about 12 months.
I was quite passionate about it, and about what I felt the story was about and what I wanted to bring out in the story. I just basically told him what I wanted to do and why I felt so strongly about it. And fortunately, he acceded to that point of view.
I have this sober kind of expression of Scottish Presbyterianism, which I come by honorably, but I'm a gay man, so inside I was thinking, Broadway! It's like, what's not to love?
I will say that when I first met Gregory, I guess I hadn't seen it yet, but after we took a walk around the reservoir or wherever we went, when I told him about my thoughts for the show and tried to persuade him to allow me to do it, when I went back, there was sheet music for Godspell on the piano, so I knew I had a chance. For me, in terms of trying to figure out how to turn it into a musical, first of all, I read the book and sort of selected what aspects of the story I thought would work well for a musical. And then it was very important to find a collaborator because I'm not a book writer. I should clarify that because the word book means two things. There is the book, the novel, that Gregory Maguire wrote, and there is what we call the book for the musical, which is the dialogue, which was written by Winnie Holtzman. And it was important for me to find who was going to write the dialogue and who was going to help me to structure the story. I felt it was important that the writer be female because the two leading characters are female, and I thought that point of view was very important. I knew I knew that she'd written some musical work earlier in her career, but basically I knew her as a television writer, and she had developed a show called My So-Called Life, of which I was a fan, and it was all young people of the age that Elphaba and Galinda are for most of the first act of the show, and I thought she really had a great feel for adolescents, and particularly adolescent women, and how they talk and how they relate. And so she was the first person I went to about it. It wasn't as if I went to several other writers and finally wound up with Winnie. Winnie was the first person I asked, and fortunately she said yes.
I had very few reservations about Stephen Schwartz as a composer and about Winnie Holtzman as a book writer. I gave them complete carte blanche liberty to do what they needed to do in order to make the story work on the stage.
When I first started working on the show, I did not really know it was going to be so much about the relationship between Elphaba and Glinda, because the book is not. Glinda's a much more minor character in Gregory's book. I thought it was going to be a show like Funny Girl or Gypsy, where it was basically a central female character, and you were following that character all the way through. It was in the development of the show that we came to realize it's really the relationship between these two women. That's the heart and core of the story, and that developed over time. It wasn't like we're going to make a musical of Gone with the Wind, or we're going to make a musical of Dr. Zhivago. It wasn't like we're taking this famous book and now we're going to make a musical of it. I think people did know the book, but it wasn't something that was deeply in the culture, and therefore we felt pretty free to select the aspects of the book we thought would work best for the musical, but also to change things, leave things out, add things in. And I have to say that Gregory Maguire was enormously supportive and generous about that process.
Why should I crowd them at their professional lives? L. Frank Baum didn't crowd me, nor did Margaret Hamilton or Judy Garland. They just let me get on with it. So I'm going to let these professionals, whose work I cherish, get on with doing the best they can with my material. And I'll see. If I don't like it, I'll be polite about it.
I became hyper aware that you could not get through a single day in America without seeing somewhere in an advertisement, in a magazine article as a title, in something someone said on a television show. You could not get through a single day without hearing some reference to a line from the movie of The Wizard of Oz.
When you have a cultural icon like The Wizard of Oz, the real conundrum is, will people still come if we change it? What bits do they see as absolutely core to that narrative that they know, love, all those characters? And I think, we are over 100 years away from the publication of the book, and there is a sense of ownership over those characters.
The job of writing a musical is to illuminate the characters and the characters' journeys by using music. So I tend to have different musical motifs and themes that express an aspect of the character. I mean, for instance, when I was first starting the show and just trying to develop musical ideas, when there was no script or really anything worked out, thinking about the character of Elphaba, and I wanted to have something that expressed kind of her inner power and strength, and I just came up with this. Just that riff that kind of felt to me like power just coming up out of the ground and coming through you, which is why I wanted that sort of very low end sound and the richness of that. There was I wanted the show to start with kind of scare, like the witch is coming to get you, so it was that. Just some kind of danger sound. And then, the other big motif for Elphaba is her sort of yearning for what she could become. And for that, just as a sort of homage, I used I was going to say the word distortion, but I don't really mean that. But I used a way of recycling Somewhere Over the Rainbow, since that's the yearning song in The Wizard of Oz. So Elphaba has what we call the Unlimited theme, where she sings Unlimited, my future is unlimited. And that goes through the show and changes in different places. And if you listen to the melody, that's Somewhere Over the Rainbow. But it's got different harmonization and a different rhythm. And I wanted to express my gratitude to Harold Arlen without actually stealing from him. So that became one of the motifs in the show. There are other little hidden tributes to the Arlen score within the show too, but that's the most salient one.
Now, we know in film the prequel and the sequel are absolutely part and parcel of that cinematic landscape. We don't see that so much in the theatre because of the very nature of going to a show and seeing the show, and then, of course, how would you deal with scheduling? But what we do see is characters or narratives being embraced and given their own time to shine.
I hope it's very clear that Wicked loves and gives gives many homages to the MGM movie. I will say that what we learned when we were developing the show was that audiences were bringing with them the MGM movie. They were not necessarily bringing the Baum books. They were not, in fact, bringing Gregory's book. They didn't care if we changed things from Baum's book. They didn't care if we did things differently than Gregory did. But the movie was the Bible. And very early on, Winnie and I came to the conclusion that we could not do anything that contradicted the 1939 movie. We treated the 1939 movie as if it were a documentary. I picked up the book thinking, if this is going to be adapted into a musical, what do we do? So, as I was reading it, I thought like, oh no, that won't work, but that's a genius idea. We want that. We want Galinda and Elphaba to be roommates, or we want to have this lion cub show up that she saves, or whatever, just things from the book that I felt, well, those should be in the show. It occurred to me that maybe the public Glinda would sing soprano the way Glinda in the movie, who comes in, Billy Burke has this kind of high warbly soprano. And so Glinda's first appearance, when she comes in the bubble, she's up in soprano register, doing, let us be. Let me see if I can hit those notes. Let us be glad. She's way up there. Let us be grateful. She's up in her soprano register. And so the idea is when she is being in front of her public, then she would sing soprano. When she's singing within her, who she is, then she's in a, whatever you want to call it, a chest voice or whatever. But then also as the story develops, when you get to Glinda in the second act, and she's starting to be much more self-aware, then she sings a song, I Couldn't Be Happier, which is more rhythmically, like popular is like 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4. It's very regular, but I Couldn't Be Happier is sort of different rhythms and different meters because it's a more mature Glinda. And so, so there's a whole arc to her character development, which I tried to have developed in the music as well.
It's excellent storytelling. It's taking characters we know and love. It's giving us something that we didn't particularly know about them before and developing, evolving and deepening that. And it's spectacle. It's absolute pure spectacle. Not only, of course, do we have those wonderful rousing numbers, Defying Gravity, that's the anthem of Wicked, just as we might argue Over the Rainbow is the anthem of The Wizard of Oz.
The sort of success outside the show of Defying Gravity has come as a surprise to me, because the structure of the song in the show is very much a book song. It stops and starts. There are all sorts of different pieces to it. It doesn't exist as a song like Everything's Coming Up Roses, where she just starts the song and sings it all the way through and that's it. It's much more book-oriented and story-oriented in the show. So the fact that it sort of has stepped out as a song has surprised me a bit, I have to say.
In the West End, it's just become the 10th longest running show. On Broadway, it's the 4th. I mean, this is some might for a show that has embraced, of course, the Wizard of Oz and those narratives, but has, just like the Wizard of Oz does, takes us behind that curtain and gives us that prequel. And I think the power in that is absolutely amazing. The fan base, the longevity, of course, what are some of the shows that it's up there in that group with? The Lion King, Phantom of the Opera. It has grossed over $1 billion on Broadway, regularly brings in over $1 million a week.
I love that the look of The Wizard of Oz is reflected in certain parts of Wicked. There's things you recognise where you're like, that's a little Easter egg, that's a little ooh to the film. When you watch the musical is definitely its own thing. It's totally its own thing. And also Wicked, the book, is its own thing. But I like the little nods and little waves to the Wizard of Oz movie in particular, not necessarily to the Baum book, but I like that when you have a little nod to 1939 going, ooh. I love that in the show Dorothy's just mentioned, she's a shadow. That's it, I think that's quite funny.
It is still performed today, it's still running in the West End and on Broadway. It's one of the highest grossing musicals of all time. It's been seen around the world. That's testament to the power of it and its storytelling and its beautiful design aesthetic. And of course, the songs, the score. It is one of those shows that has everything brought together and has a real heart and is full of emotion and also means a lot to a lot of people.
It never occurred to me to do something based on The Wizard of Oz that wasn't really in my thinking, although I will tell you that when I was in high school and starting to want to be a musical theater composer, I wrote a little show, and the leading character was a witch. So obviously there was something in my head, but I didn't think about, The Wizard of Oz, I should do something with that.
I find it very moving, and I'm especially moved by the many letters I've had from people about both the novel and the play. And I assume eventually there will be letters from people who like the movies And I will be glad for all of them. Wicked is a little green stone thrown in a dark, dark ocean. But the ripples that it has made just seem to circle, just like the spirals of a twister. They keep moving outward and they keep affecting people.
I wonder how many people have read The Wizard of Oz as a book. How many people have actually seen the film? We know, though, through sort of cultural osmosis, we know those characters, we know the Yellow Brick Road, we know some of those songs. But I think with Wicked, maybe more people have seen the show and have now the opportunity to see the film. Whether or not they go back to unwind the narrative, if you like, and go back to source will be interesting to see.
As we conclude this journey through the legacy of the wonderful Wizard of Oz and Wicked, we witness the enduring power of storytelling. From Baum's enchanting books and the iconic MGM film to Gregory Maguire's thought-provoking novel and the hit Broadway musical, these tales have transcended generations. They remind us that behind every story lies another, waiting to be told. The world of Oz continues to captivate hearts, showing us that imagination, courage, and a fresh perspective can lead us to new and wondrous paths.
My agent, in selling the novel Wicked in 1994, and it coming out in 1995, said it'll have a shelf life of maybe 6 or 7 years. You'll be lucky if it does. It might be one of these sleepers where college kids read it and pass it along. He did not expect, and I did not expect, that in time it would sell millions of copies. And sadly, the messages of both the book and of the play that is based on the book would become more pertinent as time went on. It's a sadness to me that it has become more pertinent, but it has not aged, because the challenge of trying to be good in a world in which being good is not highly prized, or at least not publicly prized, is a challenge we all face, and we face it harder and harder and more with every passing year.
It's an amazing feeling that this idea that I was told by my friend Holly Neer about this book that she was reading by Gregory Maguire, that just immediately sparked a passion in me to be part of the story, to help tell that story, to bring what I could to that story, that has somehow spoken to so many other people and seems to be continuing to do so. That's the most amazing thing that a writer can feel. That's something that I cared about and wanted to share has found a receptive audience.
No writer ever imagines being able even to afford peanut butter. So I did not imagine that I'd ever have a big audience. I did not imagine that the book would become a bestseller, or that it would launch my career into a stratosphere that I couldn't even conceive as a lower middle class kid from Albany, New York, neither of whose parents got any education beyond high school. I did not imagine any of that. But I did believe that if I was honest about my concerns, and if I was a good enough artist, that I would be able to trick people who wanted to see a Saturday Night Live parody of The Wizard of Oz into reading something that made them think, into reading something that made them consider the metes and bounds of their own ethical behavior. I didn't want to change anybody's behavior. I just wanted to remind people, we gotta keep thinking about this. We have to keep thinking about it.